Why don't we start with just an overview of your military experience and your Vietnam experience within that.
I'm glad to, Michael. Son of a World War II dad, I grew up in a neighborhood in inner city Philadelphia where everybody's father was a World War II veteran. And I think that sort of vaccinated us with this notion of service and stopping a scourge. And as we grew up, our dad stopped fascism, the Germans and the Japanese. So when Vietnam was beginning to rumble, and people were starting to think about what was going to happen, we all registered for the draft, Selective Service when we turned 18. It just sort of seemed like, well, we didn't know a lot about what was going on. There wasn't a lot out there to really, it was like we were there to stop communism. So but the way the draft worked is, they had the Selective Service had a carrot and stick. They had, if you go to college and you're trying to get a degree and you're going to help the economy and maybe participate in other ways, then you can get a deferment and stay in school. And then, if things, depending on how things are going, we'll find you. The other part of the thing was, well, if you're not doing that and your life isn't turning around and you need to get your act together, okay, Uncle Sam's gonna make a man out of you. So from 18 to 22, I'm in a small college in West Virginia, and I have a student deferment. Now, as you know, the quotas are always met. The local draft boards will get what they need, and the presidents will get the numbers they need. And as you realize over time, I'm in college from 65 to 69. Hey, that number crunch is growing and growing and growing. And it's not to disparage people who did service in the reserves and the National Guard, but Johnson never activated those troops. He didn't want to. He thought that would be another huge problem. So those folks weren't going to serve. They weren't going to get called. So we had to make the numbers. So I'm figuring guys are going while I'm still keeping my deferment. The interesting thing was, but people don't remember one of Johnson's speeches in '68 when he said he wouldn't run for re-election. Same speech, he canceled graduate school deferments. Up until '68, guys like me, I was accepted in the law school when I graduated from college in '69. I could have kept my deferment into law school. Well, that got canceled. So you keep thinking while you're my age, and I was at a small school in West Virginia, a little private school. The war seemed very distant. At times it would come home. One of the fraternity brothers' brother died. There was, there was a protest at a nearby campus. So it could come home if you watch TV, but it was still distant. But now it's getting closer and closer. So now I'm a senior, and I know that when I graduate, even though I got accepted to law school, I'm going to lose my deferment. And damn if it didn't happen. Graduated from college in May of 69. A week or two later, I'm 1A, which meant Uncle Sam, come and get me. So tumultuous summer trying to figure out what to do. Do I still go to, if I'm not drafted yet, do I try to go to law school, at least get that started? Do I enlist, in one of the branches? Do I go to Canada? Do I go to jail if I refuse induction? So, and the crazy thing is our whole generation, whether you stayed or whether you served, whether you participated or whether you protested, we all had that same machination. It touched all of us. Every day you were making a decision about Vietnam. And then the crazy thing for me was, so I never went to law school. I passed my physical in October. So I'm going to go in the Army in November, December. And lo and behold, President Nixon at the time had his new camp. He had won the presidency at the end of '68, took over in '69, and he set up a program he called Vietnamization, which was a term coined by Mel Laird, Secretary of Defense, a guy from Wisconsin, in fact, and was turning the ground war over to the South Vietnamese, escalating the air war to bring the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to the negotiating table. And so in order to show that this was going to work and he had a plan, he canceled November and December draft calls and established the lottery, which is going to be a lot more fair. We're not going to have people at draft boards who run those like fiefdoms, taking kids because they don't like them or, doing whatever they want to do. This is fair because everybody's birth date, all 366 days go into this bin and get pulled out. So I thought, like, man, I have lucked out. Because I'm telling you right now, and I'm sorry to make this long, but I want people to get a sense of what that period was like. If I'd have gone in the Army in November, good chance we wouldn't be having this conversation. There were still over 300,000 troops in Vietnam when I got over there, down from a high of 550 post Het, but still over 300,000, and they needed infantrymen. They needed, and I'm drafted. I'm convinced I would have been a grunt, and who knows what would have happened. But getting that 2 months, making it to the lottery, and of course, not having bad luck there, the day after my birthday was pulled 366, June 8th. My birthday was 85. So I knew it was going to happen. But I go in March now, Fort Dix, New Jersey, March of 1970.
What branch?
Army.
Army.
Yeah. So, I mean, look at, I'm gonna get out into the basic until almost May. That difference between November and May just made a huge difference, because then I just got lucky where I was a writer in college. I worked on the college newspaper, probably something that you yourself did as well. And even though I was an English major, I'd done a lot of writing, a lot of journalism. And when I was taking the test, and then I was getting my interview for what my MOS, military occupational specialty, was going to be, the guy said, "Tell me all the writing you've done. Tell me your background." He was helping me to get this. And right out of basic training is all the guys I'd been in basic with for 8 weeks. And that 8 weeks you go through grit and grime and sweat and tears and anxiety about what's going to happen. When we were graduating, I got pulled out of the formation, one of only like 5 or 10 guys out of hundreds of people, not just my platoon. And they marched me over to get special orders. The guy just I got a 10-day leave and money for a plane ticket to Kansas City, and I was going to the Army Hometown News Center. Well, I felt like I died and gone to heaven. When I went back in the formation, everybody's worried about me. Brad, what happened? Are you okay? I didn't want to tell them, because those guys were getting on a train that night and going down to Fort Polk, Louisiana. And their names are probably on a wall in Washington, D.C., a lot of them. So again, that just said, those quirks, and every vet will tell you this. It wasn't my day. The bullet wasn't meant for me. I got lucky. I got fortunate. I got a break. I got a huge break. So I spent several months in Kansas City at the Army Hometown News Center. Great duty. We weren't on a base. I had an apartment. It was a very cool gig. But then the levee in Vietnam, that's the way they always talk about it. With the passel of names came up. MOS, all these guys are leaving Vietnam with 71 Q20. Here's Bradley at the Army Hometown News Center. So I got the orders in July, and by November of 1970, I'm in Vietnam. Again, great luck. They put me at the, because, they're a journalist, so they were combat correspondents like me all over the country, and not in very luxurious, surroundings. I got assigned to the U.S. Army Republic of Vietnam Command Information Office. It was called USARV. MACV was in Saigon. USARV was at Long Binh. Worked in an air-conditioned office with the brass. My hooch wasn't air-conditioned, and the base got attacked 3 times I was there. We got mortared. We had guard duty. We went out in the field and covered stories. So it wasn't always, peaches and cream. But when you think of what could have happened to a guy like me, the fact that I had that kind of job, I'm carrying a pen and not a gun. I had to have a gun, but that's not my job to kill or be killed. It was quite an experience, because now if we're leaving, nobody wants to be the last GI killed in Vietnam. So that was the mantra when I was there. And so now it's like, don't put us in harm's way. Why can't we all go home? It was when I think the military really lost control of the troops. They just didn't know what to do. And that's, if you look at the numbers, the incidents of AWOL and desertion and fraggings, the whole pushback within the military, the biggest numbers were during that period, 70 and 71 into 72, because we're leaving. So let's go.
Yeah, well, we're leaving, and things are erupting in the states as well, right?
Whew.
The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in 1968, and just the increasing unrest at home. I think um, maybe some of the new guys brought a little of that with them. Um,
Yeah, especially
so
a lot of the African American soldiers. I mean, this was Black Power. I mean,
yeah,
and there was racial strife, as you just indicated, and the army was like a boiling pot for that. I mean, the numbers, and we all had guns, so it's a pretty volatile situation.
mm, mm. And so we'll come back and talk more about your time in Vietnam. But when you came home, how long did you stay in the army?
I got released out of Vietnam. What that happened was they were giving, I think another thing the Army realized was if you take Vietnam vets and try to put them back on a base and have them do what, march and salute and GI barracks, etc., it ain't going to work. So they started to increase the drop on your service commitment. So I had 2 years of active duty as a commitment. And so I had, I guess, less than I think I had about maybe 120 to 3, 4 months left to get, I'm getting out in November and they just dropped it. By the time I left Vietnam, they were giving 179-day drops. That's 6 months of active duty because they just didn't want Vietnam vets, guys that had been through some really horrible stuff, having to march around or take orders. So yeah, I got out, but the way the rotations went, then we didn't go over as units, we didn't come back as units. This must have been, maybe one of McNamara's bright ideas of how we were going to. And so people would rotate in and out of units and offices every day,
Hmm.
and so you didn't know any of the people you knew when you got there. You didn't, when you left, there was nobody at the processing center at the 90th Replacement Battalion that I knew that I had worked with for 365 days. Um, probably not the best way to do it. We had 12-month tours, Marines had 13. You could extend if you wanted to get your drop to get out. I was lucky I was getting my drop. And I came home and I didn't know if there was a Vietnam vet 5 miles from me or 500 miles from me. I didn't know any Vietnam vets.
Hmm.
And I think that sort of didn't help with our repatriation and reconciliation. A
Right.
lot we can talk about there. Shame on the country for what happened with Vietnam vets, and I'm not playing the pity card, but it's just shouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but you also didn't know, you didn't know where your brothers were.
Sure. Yeah. So, what did you do with what did you do when you came home? You obviously you built a career. Can you talk a little bit about the decades that followed?
Sure. I mean, I think I sort of deluded myself into thinking I didn't have any PTSD. One day I was driving, from I think I was going from Buffalo, New York, back to Philly, down to DC. Then I was going to see somebody, in Cleveland. And I looked down at the odometer on this car my aunt had given me as a welcome home present, her old car. And I had put on like 3, 4, or 5,000 miles in a matter. And it's like I couldn't sit still. I hadn't been in a lot of trauma, like many people had. But I was in Vietnam for 365 days, and you're anxious, you're nervous, you don't know when something crazy is going to happen. Whether you're on the base or you're on guard duty or out in the field covering a story. So I was probably a little more wired than I thought. That's why I'm getting in the car all the time. Um, Worked through relationships, tried to figure out what I wanted to do next. And I thought going back to, let's go back and get on a campus. Campuses are where it's cool. I can grow my hair, I can grow a beard, I can just let my freak flag fly. Um, and so I started applying to graduate schools. And now I'm not going to law school. I figured the law had screwed me and didn't give me a way out of Vietnam.
Right.
So I had taken the GREs in English when I was graduating from college. So I started applying to grad schools and ended up had a great correspondence with a guy who was at Washington State University, in Pullman, which is not the glamorous part of the state. It's almost in Idaho. Um, but I got money and a job and, and in-state tuition. So I went. And
Well, it's a very good journalism school. What did you
oh,
study?
it is a great journalism school. I got a master's in English. I had a minor in American Studies, but the Murrow School was there. And and I did some work with the campus newspaper, which was called the Evergreen. Did some work with the folks at Murrow. But the interesting thing was, again, Michael, was I didn't realize I still had stuff I wanted to process. That I was lucky because, again, the faculty there were kind of, I think I was the only Vietnam vet. No, there were two of us. There was another guy from Georgia, Wes Ross, two Vietnam vets in the program. So when I had a class like in bibliography of bibliographies, now does that sound boring? That's a lot of fun. That's like your intro course in grad school in English. I did mine about fiction and personal narratives about Vietnam, which was not a lot then. We're talking 1971, 72. There's not a whole, but I read all that stuff and I got into it. And I knew, what David Halberstam, he had written a novel as well as all the other stuff he'd written. I read, Vietnam Diary by Richard Tregesis. I knew Bernard Fall. I mean, it was I was getting a better lesson in Vietnam than when I was there, and I had another class where I had to do, I wrote about doctors who'd been in Vietnam, their narratives. So it was like, here I am, not realizing that I'm processing Vietnam, having my own catharsis. And lucky for me, I met and fell in love with a woman who is from Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I live. We came back here because she got into law school here. She was here during the tumultuous era. And I came back here and we set up a place called Vets House, which was a community-based service center for vets, run by vets. Nobody was helping us. We were on our own, so we cobbled some money together, a couple grants. Then we started applying for like a VA counseling contract. We did prison outreach. We became one of the models for the National Vet Center program here in Madison. And, I love Madison. I've stayed here ever since. And, it has a reputation. A lot of people think that's when the anti-war movement stopped, when the Sterling Hall bombing. And, there was a lot of craziness going on here. But I'll say Madison and its radical mayor at the time, Paul Soglin, stepped up and supported what we were doing, helped us. We had to help ourselves because we weren't getting a lot of help. And I think that helped me to get through what I needed to get through. The year of wandering around a little, the 2 years in grad school, sort of burrowing into what Vietnam was from a writing perspective, and then helping vets who were way worse off than I was. So my catharsis by 77, when I left Vets House, and I was president of that place for 2 years, and it could run you ragged. These aren't 9 to 5 jobs. They're 24/7 because vets needed help. I was ready for something else. So after an iteration a little bit as a editor of a regional publishing company, I got a job with the university, communications, writing, all that kind of what people like you and I used to do when writing was important, and you wrote speeches and press releases and all that stuff. And it took a little while. I did that for 30 years for the University of Wisconsin.
Oh, wow. Great. Well, you mentioned that, you grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. Everybody's father was a World War II vet. I think that's a great way into our conversation about the music of the era. Maybe talk a little bit about just the early years of the war, in the Kennedy administration, the attitudes of the young men who joined up to go fight, or who were drafted to go fight, and what kind of music they took with them.
Yeah. Well, that's a great entree because the thing about the soundtrack of the Vietnam War is, as you pointed out, it's broad and varied. And as I always talk about Vietnam in the classes and presentations I make, I say, you need to know the 3 W's: when you were there, where you were, and what you did, because those varied. So, I'm there in 70 and 71. I'm in the rear. I'm an Army journalist. But, I could be there at the same time, but I'm a grunt. I have a different experience. If I'm there in 68 and I'm at, Cu Chi or Bearcat or something, then it's a different experience. So how that would change your perception. And so most of the early soldiers in Vietnam were advisors, and were there to they a lot of them, like John Paul Van, probably did more fighting than maybe we ever knew or ever got reported. But we were basically, we had this notion about counterinsurgency, which was the sort of hot topic then at the Pentagon and in the military. So we were going to train the South Vietnamese army to withstand the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, the folks who were, who were North Vietnamese supporters in South Vietnam. And so, and this is a different year. A lot of these are career soldiers. I mean, even a few World War II folks, but folks in Korea, primarily men who are making their careers in the military. So they need to get their tickets punched. They need to get promotions. They need to move up in their careers. And so you didn't have a lot of them, but you had a different mindset, and that was stop communism. This is the domino theory in some ways. With all of Southeast Asia, this is where we're going to stop it. These guys some of them had fought communists in Korea, and sort of figured this was what we had to be doing, and so they had a different situation and a different aspect and a different soundtrack. If a lot of the older guys and guys that we talked to were there early, loved big band music. I mean, you would have thought this was back in World War II, with Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman. But a lot, that was the talk. The early guys went over on ships, and so I left my heart in San Francisco. I mean, you're sailing out of San Francisco, pretty close by. Mm-hmm. So, songs of that ilk, and then just songs like, that had a notion that it was okay to serve and to be in the military. Soldier Boy, the Shirelles, that's an early song. But, I mean, it's just, somebody's going to be waiting for you. What you're doing is honorable. Your country is behind you. And so, and the music, primarily then, we had Armed Forces Radio, not nearly as countrywide and permeating and penetrating as it was when I was there. But, you could have access to music, not as accessible as it was later when I was there, but music was one of the things that you could access.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how the technology changed, and how that enabled the soundtrack to change. You mentioned Armed Forces Radio, but I also was reading in your book, which is excellent, by the way, that you talked about just the pervasive availability of tape players,
Absolutely,
and cheap, like a lot cheaper than you could get them in the States.
Yeah, I think we grew up with the old Spiegel catalogs. Our parents did. I remember one of my parents' living room. It looked like a phone book, but the Paysex catalog, which was out of Japan, which is where you ordered this stuff. It was, your eyes would just, I mean, it's funny, I can go in my living room here. I still have my equipment from Vietnam. I've got my Sansui speakers and amp. I've got my, reel-to-reel Akai tape deck. It's just amazing. The stuff was, like you said, cheap, good, and obviously well crafted, because I still got it. The other thing too, Michael, about those early years is that there were a lot of units. There's a guy in our book, Marty Hoyer, who had 2 tours in Vietnam, one early, one later, and 2 very different tours. But Marty was a career soldier, went in the Army in the 50s, and helicopter pilot. And he and other guys that used to play music would form these little, they were called the hired help. The high-priced help, because they were all officers. And they would have competitions. This is in Vietnam, in combat, probably, essentially, and in combat and helicopter pilots. And they would have competitions with other units, so generals would set this up on who could be the best Kingston trio, who could sound and adapt the tunes to the current set, so they would change a lot
Lyrics.
of the words in them
Hmm.
to, instead of, sitting on the dock of the bay, sitting in the, the front of my truck, and, just old things about, any of the old songs like 500 miles, and going down the road feeling bad. Um, so you had some more popular sounds. Things are changing as you get more troops, but essentially these guys were older guys, career soldiers, listening to a different kind of music, and maybe starting to buy the equipment, but in no way having sort of what we had, because this is still pre-Adrian Cronauer, who everybody sees as the person who sort of was the established that soundtrack, and was the one who knew that what the music meant to the morale of the troops and what they could do to lift their spirits. And that's what the disc jockeys did. Frankly, they did a great job about it.
Mm. Mm. So as the the Kennedy years kind of tick by, and our involvement in Vietnam begins to unfold, how does the music reflect that, the change in taste, the change in availability?
Well, it's interesting because, the Marines landed at Da Nang in March of '65. Um, this is after the Gulf of Tonkin. And so now we're fully committed. What maybe was a counterinsurgency war and a lot of training and a lot of advising is now becoming our fight. And, the notion was early on, we're going to go in there, clean up this mess. We'll be out in no time. I mean, we're fighting a bunch of guerrillas, I mean, these straw hats, I mean, they don't know what the hell they're doing. Well, we learned pretty soon that that was not necessarily the case, but we still didn't know, America didn't know a whole lot about where Vietnam was, what the fight was about, who was who. But we're stopping communism. That much we knew. So some of the early music, this is when "Hello Vietnam" by Johnny Wright comes out, that everybody knows from Full Metal Jacket, that opening scene when everybody's getting their hair cut. Distant Drums by Jim Reeves. Um, Our Daddy's in Vietnam. So a lot of the songs are about it's time to serve. Loretta Lynn has a great song, "Dear Uncle Sam," where she's basically saying, "Don't take my husband. I mean, he's mine." And then, of course, she gets the dear, widow letter. So it's just, you got to serve. It's not. It's a challenge, but we got to do it. That's just when the Green Berets comes along.
The Ballad of the Green
Out of the
Berets.
Green Berets by Sergeant Barry Sadler. Like, when you think of all the incredible music in 1966, still had the British invasion. The Beatles are at the top of the charts. The Stones, the Animals, Herman's Hermits. All the British groups. How good Motown was. The Supremes, the Temptations, Smokey, the Four Tops. Stevie, all the great music, and country. How good country was. The best of country. Cash and Haggard and Jennings. The Ballad of the Green Berets was the number one song of 1966. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I
But
mean, when you think about some of the other music that came out in '66, that's pretty astounding.
I know. But you realize what it tapped into is, we don't know what this is. This guy's telling us it's honorable. In fact, only three wear the Green Beret. I mean, so you're proud, you're chosen, but you got a job to do. It's got a little cadence in there. And you put it on my son's chest at the end. Your father was a Green Beret. Maybe you can. It's service, it's sacrifice, and it's no questions asked. You're going to do that. And so you got that. That's early on what you had. The crazy thing is, Eva Destruction comes out at the same time, Barry McGuire. Um, and that was banned on some radio stations. My colleague Craig Werner, who I co-wrote "We Got to Get Out of This Place" with, Craig said that he was in Colorado Springs, and it's a heavy military community there, and he said that they banned Eva Destruction on the radio because they thought it was anti-America, and it was propagandistic. But the Green Berets and that whole notion and ethos held sway. Got to do this, time to do it. It's an honorable and the right thing to do. And that's where some of the early music was going. And that's what people in Vietnam were hearing.
Hmm. So what changed? What was the trigger?
Everything. I think what changed was that, people started to, the crazy thing about that war is one of the many of the crazy things, and not just the access to music, which you and I keep talking about, is that that war was opened up to journalists um, in pretty substantial ways. You know, everybody knows about Halberstam and Sheehan and Malcolm Brown, but every good writer of that generation cut his or her teeth in Vietnam. You had to cover Vietnam like you had to cover the civil rights movement. You know, there's a couple great collections at the, I think it's, oh, I forget the, if it's the Columbia School of Journalism. They have compilations. One's on the civil rights movement and one's on the Vietnam War. And we used to have those in our class when we taught, and especially the one about Vietnam. But you realize you see a lot of the same writers in both books. You know, James Baldwin and David Halberstam and Mary McCarthy and Francis Fitzgerald. I mean, all the folks of that era who covered the big issues covered Vietnam. You know, I mean, this is the only war we got. You got to be a war correspondent. But the army and the military let people get accessible. And if you look back at some of those old film clips, there would be, you know, this isn't the way news is now, where you have little sound bites and, you know, you get 10 minutes of the weather and 5 minutes of sport. They would have long pieces about Vietnam. So you're getting Morley Safer's piece about we had to destroy the village in order to save it, and they put the hooch on fire. You're getting John Lawrence, you know, with troops right there when they're getting fired upon, when guys are getting killed. So you're getting Jack Smith at the Adrang Valley, you know, which became Joe Galloway's, you know, marvelous book. And I miss Joe dearly. He's a lovely guy and a great journalist. So we're starting to see this. It's coming into your living room. And I think that started to have an impact because now you realize this isn't cowboys and Indians and this isn't easy. This is rough and it's ugly. And, you know, it doesn't look like we're gaining it. We're making any progress here. So I think that started to switch on a light. And then you have people starting to say, I'm not going to go do that. I mean, I don't understand what the fight's about. You know, Muhammad Ali, you know, I mean, you know, no South Vietnamese ever called me the N word. I mean, nor Vietnamese. So you're getting pushback, you're getting protest, and so you're seeing it. You're getting eyewitness accounts every night on your television set. So I think the combination of things now, things really start to, and the music's there to reflect that. You have protest music. You know, you've got, you know, Masters of War. You've got A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. You've got the Draft Dodger Rag. You've got Lyndon Johnson Told the Nation. You know, conversely, you still have, you know, Chris Christopherson and Tom T. Hall and Ernest Tubb saying, hell no. It's so you've got this cacophony a little bit now. And the country's trying to figure it out. So where are you at a coffee house? You hear one song. You're at a protest, you might hear another song. If you're at a country bar, you're going to hear another song. The music, I think, started to begin to amplify what was going on with society at large. And it became, you know, not just an expression of that. Sometimes it would anticipate or, you know, light a fuse to some of what was happening.
You know what I think is so interesting is this. It's almost a dichotomy because the technology of just having a a Sanyo tape player that was battery powered in your hooch, it enabled individuals or small groups to sort of have their own soundtrack for the war. And yet, at the same time, music was sort of a unifying force, right? It fragmented and unified at the same time.
Isn't that a crazy dichotomy? And it's absolutely true. When I think back on all the interviews we've had for the book and then all the presentations we made and where we get more people sharing and reflecting and volunteering information, you really get that sense. There was a guy, Alan LaPesca, who grew up in northern Wisconsin. He's in the book. And he grew up listening to polka music. The only radio station they could get at his farm in Wisconsin was a polka station. And he ends up, he's a medic in a unit, I think near Nha Trang. He's there 67, 68. And he's with a lot of African American. He's never seen a black person in his life, and now he's serving with them. He's listened to the Chambers Brothers. He's listened to Cream. He's listened to the Mamas and the Papas. He's listened to the Ten. I mean, his whole world changed, and it was a sonic change for him, and he's delighted about that. On the other hand, we have stories of guys who, we had great cover bands, as you mentioned with the music and its accessibility. We had the tape decks, we had AFVN, we had the real tape decks, we had the troubadours and the hooch that could play, but you also had great cover bands, Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino. Couldn't speak a word of English, but they could nail a set list. They could play the hell out of rock and roll.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes if somebody wanted them to play Sam and Dave, and somebody else wanted them to play Bobby Bear, there would be some exchange. There were some ugly moments. There were some real ugly moments, and it happened with the jukebox too. The funny story is about Colin Powell, who we just lost. Wonderful human being in many many ways, and what he did as a breakthrough in his career. His second tour of Vietnam, one of the things he had to do was he had to mediate what was being played at the EM clubs on the jukebox because they were having too many problems.
You mean fighting, guys fighting over the
Yeah,
jukebox?
guys saying, I mean, if you play Detroit City one more time, I'm gonna knock you out. And Colin said he decided that 70% would be, white artists and white music. I mean, that's including like, CCR and other groups.
Yep.
30% would be black. And so the whites would only be pissed off 30% of the time. The blacks would be mad 70% of the time. And a couple of the Chicano guys we interviewed in the book said, "Well, where's our music?
Right.
What about us?"
Yeah.
But it was so music did have that power, and I'd like to say, and I do believe the record would show when I look at it, and I mean, we're several hundred out of many thousands into millions, but that music did more to pull people together, especially when they needed to be pulled together, than it pulled them apart. And
Yeah.
I
It's
can think
almost,
of many a moment when we would embrace, lock arms, regardless of who we were in the EM club when they were playing. We got to get out of this place, and saying that last line, "There's a better life in the USA."
yeah. Yeah. It's starting to become a little clearer for me now. It seems like, when music was more fragmented, it was a lot of it was music that was not of the era, right? It was music that existed independently of the war. It was music that people were listening to before they went to Vietnam. And that's when I can sort of imagine the fragmentation and people fighting. I want to hear Merle Haggard. No, I want to hear Otis Redding. Um, but then you have music that is of the time. It is of and from and about the Vietnam era. It's defined. The Vietnam War is the backdrop for all creative endeavors, including music. And so then you begin to have music that maybe is a little more uniting because it's about the thing that we all share, the thing that we have in common, rather than about our differences. And so, in that context, I think we have to talk about a lot of people, but for sure we have to talk about Jimi Hendrix.
Absolutely. Um, and there's a couple funny stories. Eric Burden was one of the people we got to interview for the book.
Mm-hmm.
Lead singer of the Animals, and then was in a group called War. And he said one time when he met Hendrix, and they were seeing a protest. They were in London together, and there was a protest going on, and Burton said something about it, and Hendrix. Sort of turned to him and said, no, he says, listen, he says, there might be something right here. They could be in San Francisco, meaning, the enemy, the communists, the Viet Cong. So, I mean, here's Hendrix, who a lot of people don't know was in the military, um,
Mm-hmm.
hard scrabble upbringing. And what happened to a lot of guys in that era, he got into trouble with the law, and he's up in front of the judge, and it's like 30 days and $300, or the recruiter's just down the street. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll drop everything. And so Hendrix goes in, and by all accounts, he was a horrible soldier.
He
All he
ended up
wanted,
in the 101st Airborne, didn't he?
exactly.
Yeah.
That's where, excuse me while I kiss this, kissing the sky is what paratroopers say. So everybody wonders what that line is, and they misinterpreted, said, "Excuse me while I kiss this guy." No, he's kissing the sky because he's a paratrooper. All he wanted to do was play his guitar, so the army kicked him out. Um, but he discovered, I think, that time in the service, and he met Buddy Miles there. Buddy was in the service as well. When they and getting a feel for what was going on and how that sounded really affected his sound. And I think there's probably, and we've had this echoed by a number of the folks we interviewed, there's nobody who sonically is Vietnam like Hendrix. That doesn't mean, all the people we talked to and some of the old career soldiers and older soldiers, could rally around that. But if you heard that, if you hear Machine Gun, even parts of Purple Haze, if you hear Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock, which is a little later, but you know, Hendrix captured that sound of Vietnam. There's a great line in Michael Herr's Dispatches where he says, if I think he says something like Hendrix was the forward scout in terms of, making that, penetrating that wall of what Vietnam was. And so, and Purple Haze, I mean, for some folks, that's a song about LSD. It is. I mean, there was a kind of acid that was called Purple Haze. They were color coded in the day. So sure, that's an acid song. It's a drug song. But for a lot of guys, one of the smoke bombs that you popped at LZ's was purple. So a lot of guys would talk about what was that song that guy talking about, because it takes them back to having a chopper rescue them. Purple Haze for them is rescue and safety. So it's really kind of interesting how somebody like Hendrix, who I'm sure his politics evolved. He had that great statement on the Dick Cavett show when he was getting static about why he played the Star Spangled Banner the way he did, and he said, "That's my country, that's my song," and and then he infused everything into it. That that he could become in many ways what we were hearing and seeing around us in Vietnam, and it's not the kind of tune you can sort of whistle while you work. I mean, this is noise, this is battle, this is gunfire, this is chaos, and that was a lot of what combat in Vietnam was like.
Hmm. Hmm. So where are we now? We're 68, 69-ish, 70 maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
What's going on in Vietnam and at home that becomes such fertile ground for protest music? Like,
Yeah.
why is protest music really starting to become almost a genre of its own?
Well, I think, the easy answer is everything was happening. When you look at what was going on in terms of pushback against authority, um, and um, and just sort of following, um, in the foot, yeah, doing what you were told to do and what was expected of you. Um, if you look at what's happening at race in America at the time, and we have a great story in there about "Chain of Fools" by Aretha Franklin, which when it came out and I was in college, I heard that song as another, and it's a good takeaway of the song. It's Aretha saying again, like she did in Respect, "Hey, if you're going to treat me like crap, I'm out of here. I'm done with this relationship. I'm breaking this chain." But if you're African American in the country at that time, that's a civil rights song. What Aretha's doing to a white audience is what I heard. To her brothers and sisters, she's saying it's our time. I mean, there's no more powerful image in African American culture than slavery, the chains of slavery. And so what they're hearing her say is, the chains are coming off. We're going to get what's ours. They passed the bills, but we still don't have it. So we're going to get it. If you guys heard that in Vietnam, and one of the guys we interviewed heard that song right after Dr. King was assassinated, and we all talk about, and you sort of previewed this by saying the era and what was happening. Everybody looks at the Tet Offensive as that big turning point. We all know it was basically a suicidal mission on the part of the North Viet Cong, but they captured most of the provincial capitals. They were fighting guys like me in Saigon and Long Binh, um, and that got on the news. And it was like every Walter Cronkite, the Walter Cronkite, Uncle Walter, goes on the news and says, "I thought we were winning this war." And President Johnson said when he lost, he said, "If I had lost Walter Cronkite, I'd lost the country." Um, and so, but if you talk to black soldiers, it's King's assassination. That is their I mean, that's when they said, and that there you go to Chain of Fools. One of the guys said that when he heard the news, and it's another whole story about how the news got spread in Vietnam about King and other important events. But when he heard the news, he wanted to shoot the first white guy he saw. Luckily, nobody was in the hooch. He wasn't out so he didn't do it. But he sat down and listened to the Lady Soul album by Aretha, and there's a line in there about the chain is going to break. I've taken all I can take, and that becomes the chain of command. And if the guys down here aren't doing what you order them to do, the guys up here can't get done what they're giving orders about. So
Mm-hmm.
if the chain of command breaks, things break down. And so you got a song that is about three different things to three different audiences simultaneously. And that's the crazy thing that music began to do. Nancy Sinatra's "These Boots Are Made," sitting on Dock of the Bay. I mean, just so many songs. Like you said, we took them with us, but when they were there, they became something else. And if we brought them back home, or there was something that hit us back home, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, some of the music that came after, that that's how the soundtrack played. And I think you can't find probably any era that was more combustible and cacophonous than the era you're talking about, because it's the height of Black Power, um, riots in America, assassinations. I mean, everything. The society's breaking down. Huge anti-war protests. A lot of pushback in the military as well in itself, and just a whole generation of people who basically the only thing they can agree on is how good the music is. And so, I think if it weren't for the music, maybe we all would have lost our minds, because it was that kind of time. And you could see it. I mean, the Beach Boys aren't doing fun anymore. They're doing Good Vibrations. What in the hell's that about? I mean, James Brown, I thought he had a brand new bag, or he felt good. No, he's saying it loud. He's black and he's proud. Things were just like, whoa.
Yeah. Yeah. What a time. Um, by the way, have you seen there's a kind of a multi-part series documentary on Apple TV right now called 1971, the year that music changed everything. Have you seen any of that?
Um, it's funny. I was in a CNN. I was in two things that were on CNN where I got interviewed, um, and I wasn't in the. Was it? No. Yeah. That I've heard about it. I haven't seen it yet.
Oh,
Um,
you got
but
to watch it.
Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, did a thing called Soundtracks on CNN. Unfortunately, kept getting preempted because it was around the time, because it's a news network. It was about the time that Trump fired Comey, and so they were doing in-depth news all the time. But there's one of the episodes in there is about Kent State,
Mm.
and Craig and I are in that at length. It's a really good episode, and they talk a lot about Ohio, and we got to get out of this place in that segment. But yeah, no, I haven't seen that, but I will check it out.
Yeah, you mentioned we got to get out of this place. I can't believe we gotten this far into the conversation. We haven't really talked about that song, which, by the way, is where the title of your book comes from. How important? When we did a little bit of an informal poll on our Facebook page, we asked folks, "What song do you most associate with that era?" And I mean, the winner just fought like it wasn't even close. "We Got to Get Out of This Place" was number one, by a long shot. Um, I mean, is that song even about? Is it about the war, or is it just one of those things
Not, no,
that just got
exactly.
got co-opted?
Exactly. Like a lot of people, I mean, in every film, every documentary, any show about Vietnam or the 60s is going to have For What It's Worth on the soundtrack as well. It's not about Vietnam, but everybody thinks it's about Vietnam and about the protest. Similarly, Cynthia Weil and Barry Mann, the songwriters for We Got to Get Out of This Place, intended that song to be the follow-up to You've Lost That Love and Feeling by the Righteous Brothers. And if you hear, I don't know if I can send you the audio. I think you can find it now, since we started to talk about it. I think Barry Mann's version of that is available. You could go out and find it. And it was a demo that he wanted the Righteous Brothers to hear. But it's really pretty good, but it's a whole different song because they wanted it to be sort of a get out of the ghetto song. And it's got that Phil Spector Wallace sound. It's slower. It's kind of got a lot of call and response. But that's what the intention was. Well, the way the music industry worked in those days was crazily the sheet music ends up in London, and Alan Klein and Mickey Most, who are running the Animals and their own music stuff, find it. They show it to the Animals, who are, hardscrabble guys in Newcastle who are coming up to London, and they look at it and say, "This is our song. This is what we're doing. We got out of there. We're not going to be like our fathers and slave away in the factories. We're going to be rock and roll stars. So we got to get out of this place. Is us."
Mm-hmm.
Well,
it's about escaping their circumstance.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And the crazy thing is that, and we talked to Cynthia Weil when we way back when we started the book, and she said she admits they were really pissed when they heard that because that's not the version they wanted out, and it wasn't anything what they intended until they started to get the royalty checks, and then they sort of they calmed down. But
yeah, maybe I'm not that mad.
Then it gets to Vietnam, and like I told you, the day I got to Vietnam, I knew the day, knock on wood, I knew the day I was going to get out. So that notion of getting out of that place had a date, had a finite, something attached to it. And so that song just became, if we live long enough, if we get through this, we're going to get out of this place. And that's our song. And it becomes Vietnam. I mean, I don't think you talk to any Vietnam vet and not say that's not a Viet. It is, it's ours, but that's not how it was written.
Right. Yeah. You talked about you talked about the change from the draft boards to the draft lottery system, and the idea that would be more fair, that would be more equitable, and that is largely true. I mean, the draft itself did become more fair and more equitable when it switched over to a lottery system. But of course, deferments were not always distributed fairly or equitably. And so that brings us to Fortunate Son, which is another one that was, received a huge response from our Facebook followers.
Well, and CCR just in and of themselves, that's when I think that was really pretty much the first time, because we were ready to just say, tastes great, less filling, in more vulgar ways to one another and not get along. That a rock and roll group like that, two of whom had service in their resumes, Fogerty and Doug Clifford, and but they knew who was doing the fighting and dying, and they were the ones that said you can be against the war but not against the soldier. God bless them. I mean, that was a real breakthrough. And plus, I mean, the music's so darn good. I mean, it's not like they don't know what they're doing, but and so much of their stuff, Run Through the Jungle, Bad Moon Rising. It just seemed like they had their fingers on the pulse, and they said, we know this could be us. We're here for you guys. We hope you get back safe. And damn that war anyway. And nothing does it better than that song, because it basically says, okay, who's doing the fighting and the dying? Well, it ain't the senator's son. It ain't the millionaire's son. It ain't me. But it is me. And I think that really resonated. And I think, you know, the story that Fogerty later told, that that was basically David Eisenhower, Julie Nixon's husband, that he was thinking of when he did Fortunate Son.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah, that's what that's what Fogerty told Craig when Craig interviewed CCR. And you know, the sad thing is what happened to CCR as a group, and the sort of bickering and fighting they did for so many years because of the way they didn't manage their money, and I mean their music rights and their careers. And then you know Cliff Fogerty's brother died. But I mean, I think probably other than what you mentioned with "We Got to Get Out of This Place," there's no group and no you know canon of music that resonates more than what CCR did, because it's all, you know, a lot of that's there with, you know, with their stuff too.
Hmm. You know, here's something that you and I have not talked about, which you know, at the risk of opening potentially another another a whole new avenue for the conversation. You mentioned Eric Burden and the Animals having accidentally written, or not written, excuse me, having accidentally recorded what became the anthem for the Vietnam soldier. Is there anybody you can think of from outside the United States who wrote or recorded music on purpose to address the Vietnam War as an issue,
Um,
and had some success, made some impact with it?
you know, impact probably not so much that I can think of offhand. Jimmy Cliff has a great song called Vietnam, and it's just it's reggae, and it's relatively early in the war, and you know Vietnam, Vietnam, and he gets a letter from his buddy, and his buddy says, "I'm okay. Tell everybody I'm fine. I'll be home in a couple of weeks." Then his mother gets the letter. He's not coming home. He got killed, and 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 Jimmy Cliff keeps going, and it's a great song, but you know it's got a hard message. Um, there was a song. Chuck Hagel's favorite song, Master Jack by Three Jacks and a Jill, which was an Australian group. Um, it's a strange, strange world we live in, Master Jack. Well, that becomes Chuck and Tom Hagel's song as they're serving together, and they shouldn't have been as brothers. Five Purple Hearts between them, but you know, so it's like sometimes you couldn't even fathom what somebody's song is going to be other than you know like we got to get out of this place, but it's all peculiar to your own circumstances. And you know, I'm trying to think. Yeah, there were obviously some British groups and some songs. You know, and Donovan had Susan on the West Coast waiting from you know Anthony in Vietnam fighting. Yeah, there were some, but nothing I think that had both it there and here at home the kind of impact. And maybe I'm just forgetting something.
I mean, Satisfaction comes to mind, but you know, again, that was accidental, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if Satisfaction was as important at the time, but certainly in films, you know,
Oh yeah.
looking back at the war, Satisfaction is part of almost every Vietnam War soundtrack that I could think, or at least it feels that way.
Yeah, well, and now as we're talking about it, I think of another animal song, Sky Pilot, you know, which, you know, I mean, almost every chopper pilot that was there after that song was, you know, when that song was out and later, talks about that song as being, you know, for them being what they did and who they were.
Hmm.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. It actually reminds me of another tune that we haven't talked about, which I think would be a good segue into our next topic, Treetop Flyer, which is one of my all-time favorite songs, I think. And that takes us into, you know, after the war, not necessarily after the war, but after it's soldiers who've come home from Vietnam,
Yeah, yeah, and
or who've survived the war. And you know, there's a whole kind of subset of songs about Vietnam um, after the fact. You know, Charlie Daniels, um,
still in Saigon.
Billy Joel, Goodnight Saigon.
Yep.
I hadn't thought about Treetop Flyer as belonging in that group, but it certainly does.
Oh, I think that's a good call on your part. Not a lot of people would put it, or, make that kind of connection. Um, and the what happened musically, is that was again, and I really can't understate this enough of how essential music was in Vietnam. I think it's one of the things the Army definitely got right. They knew that we needed creature comforts, and they gave that to us. They got guys like me who don't want to be there. He's a reluctant soldier. I'm trying to get out of that place, trying to stay alive, but I have to write positive stories so I keep the morale of the troops up. The AFVN disc jockeys are playing music to keep their boost their morale. Music was a way, and giving us access to as much music as we've talked about here. But it's worth restating. It's like, our dads didn't have that in World War II. Current soldiers have their own playlists and MP3 players and headsets, their own. It's not a shared soundtrack. We all shared the music, and we loved it, and they gave it to us, and so we could have it. So for a lot of vets coming back, music was a place they turned for that kind of comfort. Yeah, because they weren't getting it from their country, they weren't getting it from their neighbors or friends, in many cases, even their families. And so, not just listening to music, and like you said, not just the music we had brought home with us that we still loved, that made, maybe didn't make us cry anymore because it made us laugh. I feel like I'm fixing to die rag, for example.
Mm.
But also maybe making their own music. And there were a bunch of Vietnam vets who came back, none of whom had illustrious careers that would roll off the tongue between you and me, even though we've both been around a little bit, and heard a lot of bands that never made it to the big time. But but there were other artists too, as the couple that you mentioned, and Bruce Springsteen, comes to mind,
You bet.
and Dan Daly, who we interviewed, who wrote Still in Saigon. When he wrote it originally about Korea because he didn't want to write about Vietnam because it was too near and dear to him, even though he didn't serve. But he wanted to place it in another place, like MASH, the movie that was originally set in Vietnam. Um, and if you see that, you think it's about Vietnam, but it's based in Korea because Hollywood didn't want the movie to be set in Vietnam. Dan didn't want his song set, but then he decided, no, I got to be honest about this. This is about what happened. And he had two groups when he got the song done, and he had an agent. They sent it to two people, Bruce Springsteen and Charlie Daniels. And Charlie Daniels took it. But it says something about Springsteen too, who has really stood up for and stood by Vietnam vets. Bobby Muller, who you'll read about in the book later in the last chapter, who was a paralyzed Vietnam vet, Marine, and helped form the Vietnam Vets of America organization, VVA. Bobby says that, Bruce, without Bruce, that organization never would have existed, and never would have been able to do the good work it's done for Vietnam vets. And he credits Bruce with a concert that he gave in LA in 1981 called the Concert for the Vietnam Vet, where he invited Vietnam vets, and they were wheelchairs accessible around the stage. And it was the first time. Springsteen was a rock and roll kid then. He grew up, and his stuff was like, we got to get out of this place. That's one of his favorite songs. I mean, hard scrabble, blue collar, and could have been in Vietnam. His first drummer, Bart Haynes, was killed in Vietnam. He knows he and his buddies could have been in Vietnam. And so he came out basically and talked to the audience for the first time, as a person, and talked about the vets that were there and what the debt that we owed to Vietnam vets. And then he sang "Who'll Stop the Rain." But that was a huge night for Bruce. And when you listen to, I mean, even Devils and Dust, which is about Iraq, but go back to Brothers Under the Bridge, Lost in the Flood, etc. I mean, that's Vietnam. Born in the USA. You listen to that. Wait a minute, what's that? Well, that's about growing up tough and and in a blue collar town and never getting a chance. Then you go to the war. They don't want to give you a job when you get back. Your brother got killed in Vietnam. I mean, that is a tough song, but a lot of people missed what that was about. So I think music became a place where you could go by yourself and try and get back home. Or maybe you could do it with a few others, or maybe you could inspire a songwriter. Bobby Mueller still claims that he's the hard rockin' daddy in the USA that gave Bruce the idea for the song. Um, and Charlie Daniels, like you said, Billy Joel, Paul Hardcastle has a song called 19, which sounds like a disco song.
Yeah, I
But
remember it.
yeah, Walking a Thin Line, Huey Lewis, it's all about PTSD. My neighbor doesn't know what's going on with me. He won't ask me, he won't talk to me. I'm struggling here. I'm walking a thin line. Um, you know, Orange Crush by REM. I mean, there's probably a lot more, as much about music as the two of us know. There's probably stuff we're missing. Um,
Oh,
that
I had a colleague point one out to me the other day. I'm aware of the Lumineers. I've actually seen them. I went to a show, a live show one time,
me too.
but I don't, I haven't followed them that closely. And apparently, there's at least one song in their catalog about an uncle who's on the wall.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
So
now I've got to go check that out.
yeah, and I think I mentioned to you that their first album, that the Hey Ho's on, has a song called Charlie Boy, and that could be it because it's about somebody who listened to Kennedy's call, asked not what your country can do for you, served and was killed in the war. Somebody comes to the parents' home and gives them the sad news. So that could very well be the person. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I mean, let's face it. I always, I thought we would still be fighting the Vietnam War until the last one of us, was not here anymore, because it was America's second Civil War in many ways. Now we've been superseded by, COVID and culture wars and George Floyd and everything else. Vietnam's not the touchstone anymore. We're not the most significant generation. In fact, Vietnam vets are dying in pretty rapid numbers. There's not a whole hell of a lot of this left anymore, considering. So that, but since it affected all of us, it was that pivot point. Well, probably not so anymore. I don't think it's 9/11 as much, although that is in a way. Now it's these last couple years. So where we go musically with that will be interesting to see. I doubt it'll be something we all share like we did in Vietnam and continue to do now. Um,
Well, again, I
but
think technology plays a role there, right? I mean, now everybody's got their own earbuds. Like you don't have to share a musical moment or experience or feeling with anybody else. I mean, you
yeah,
know, I don't know anybody who listens to radio.
no, that's a really good point. And radio was our internet. You know, back in the day, whether you were in Dallas or Detroit, you know, Bismarck or Boston, the guys sounded the same and they pretty much played the same set list. So if you didn't want to hear Little Green Apples, or Patches, you just had to wait because Satisfaction and My Girl were going to come on. You had to be patient. You had to be patient. And you're right, that's all gone. And even though now anybody could probably access any song that's ever been recorded, they're not sharing it. I mean, not necessarily. Whereas, as we pointed out, for us, that was in our DNA. That's who we were as a generation, and we shared it. The funny thing is that,
Well, and you shared it. Pardon me. This is
yeah,
important. This is an important point, though.
there
I
you go.
think you shared it in context, right? I can
Good
listen
quote.
to a song that I like on my earbuds, and I can share that song with you. But I'm not going to be there when you hear it. And more importantly, we're not going to be sharing an experience at the same time that we're hearing the song.
Very, very well said. And the point we just made about the accessibility of music, the great thing was when we taught our class, um, and these kids would come in. They were born late 1990s, early 2000s. I mean, this could be the Peloponnesian War. They have no idea about Vietnam, but they know the music. They come in and they know the Doors and they know the Temps and they know Otis and they know James Brown. They know Aretha. And it's so funny because then what we do is we put that song, the context we create is there's a song. Now there's a song experience and somebody's history there, their Vietnam connection. And then we can start to give them their bearings on, what Vietnam was about, watch some movies, see some CBS clips, but it's really the music that cements that for them. So it's a great way to teach too.
Yeah, sounds like a fun class. I wish I could take it. Um, I think I was thinking about this when you were talking about Springsteen, right? I mean, for a young person coming into your class, you know, they know a lot of the what, they don't know all of the why. Sometimes the why is very apparent. Fortunate Son, it's pretty clear what that is about, if you have any sense of history. But, those kids are aware of Springsteen, but I don't know that they connect those dots in quite the same way, because it's a little more oblique in
Hmm.
some
Yeah.
in a way.
Well, and you look what we've done to music. I mean, we did, like I said, when we're talking about 1966 and the Ballad of the Green Berets, we didn't start to stratify and segment music until later. Everybody talks about Okie from Muskogee as sort of being that, okay, country's now going to go this way. Country wasn't always there. I mean, listen to some of that other stuff. It wasn't all, this is great. I mean, Johnny Cash talking Vietnam blues, after he'd been there. Um, so, but then it changed, and it's like, okay, we're pro-war, we're patriots. Not that the rest of us aren't, but you start, and then you got to listen to this, and you got to listen to that. This is over here. If you like this, you can't like that. That's not the way our soundtrack was, and it's too bad, because I think it deprives us of other experiences, and appreciations that could help bring us together a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think that's an important point, right? I mean, especially now, where we're so the culture wars that you talked about, we're pretty fragmented. I mean, even to the point where, you and I don't get the same results for the exact same Google search,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Our entire, everybody's pipeline of information is tailored. There is no Walter Cronkite.
Right, right. That's absolutely right.
Um,
Yeah,
and
no, go.
and so I wonder, for the younger, the current generation of fighting men and women, people who came home from Iraq or Afghanistan. Um, I wonder if we had this conversation about music of that era. I wonder if we would find so much common language, so much shared experience.
You know, I haven't nearly interviewed or talked with as many Iraq and Afghan vets as I have Vietnam vets. But I think I mentioned to you before that when we taught the class and we had large numbers, one of the wonderful things they have for teachers, professors, is they have TAs, teaching assistants. So we had two TAs in that class. One was, both of whom were ex-Marines. One a black guy from New York City, another guy a white kid from Minnesota. And the students would want to ask them about their experiences and how different it was than Vietnam. And they talked about what they went to, because this is where the foundation of our course was, that there was no shared soundtrack, there was no communal music. Whenever they had that, whenever they had a night where only one, where they took off their own headsets and people were hanging around and drinking beer and talking, and some one person was playing music, it would be music from our era. It would be CCR, or it would be Hendrix, or it would be the Doors, or it would be the Beatles. I mean, so yeah, we've lost that, and I think you're right. The technology and the way the industry has gone um, is not always the best way for it to go, because we don't have we don't have those things that um, we can bring to one another musically that we used to. We're over here. You listen, like you said, your search is yours, mine is mine. I've got this, and the way that works. Adrian Cronauer, we talked about him before. The epitome of the AFVN disc jockey. Started the Dawn show, the Dawn Buster morning show, and I think you probably know this. You'll find out in the book. Do you know who followed him on AFVN? Pat Sajak was was the next Adrian Cronauer. But Cronauer's a guy, and so we have to talk to him. We have a lot of armed forces disc jockeys. I love these guys. Mostly men. There's some women too. We mentioned a lot of the women, including the Donut Dollies that played music in Vietnam. But they saved our lives in many ways. And So we had to get the Croan hour. And when we got to his people, and I think you know the story, that he and Robin Williams, who played him in the film, are about as far apart as you can be. Williams is a lefty liberal, or was, in California and Hollywood. Cronauer, hard crunching right winger. He worked for Dick Cheney. Um, had a whole different take on the world. And so when we got to his handlers, because Cronauer was still alive then, um, the word we got back was he did not want to be interviewed by two people from the People's Republic of Madison.
Wow.
So there you go. I mean, it's like, wait a minute, this is about music. It's about great things that you did. And yet it's not about politics, but he thought we were communists from Madison, because of the reputation Madison has. Well, the good thing is there was so much in public domain about him that we could just quote it and refer to it, and because you had to put him in the book. But he didn't. Adrian Cronauer didn't want to talk to us.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. What a time.
Yeah.
I think about that. The span of that war was, it really was a generation. Our involvement there started in essentially the mid 50s, 55 or so. Saigon fell in 75. That's 20 years, man. A guy who went over there in 72 or 73 was a generation behind someone who went over there in 56 or 57.
Yeah.
Almost an entire generation.
Well put.
It's fascinating for me to think, you opened the conversation talking about, where were you? What did you do? And who were you with? And that, I think the point you were trying to make was, everybody had his own Vietnam experience.
Right.
There is no one Vietnam experience. There are 3 million Vietnam experiences. Having said that, it's fun to imagine, if you could imagine a soldier who was there for the entirety of it, right? This is a population that started out doing what they felt was, number one, expected of them, the sacrifice they were expected to make, following the example of their fathers, right? Meeting the expectation of their community, answering the call of liberty. So in a way, very much kind of dialed in, kind of calibrated to the expectations of that greatest generation. And at the end, you got the exact opposite. I'm going to rebel against you and everything you stand for and your authority, which, I don't think is legitimate. You don't like long hair? I'm going to grow my hair long. You don't like drug culture? I'm going to take a lot of drugs. You think Glenn Miller's awesome? Check this out.
Yeah, no,
it is a dramatic, you can't turn the crank any farther than that.
I totally agree. And when you think of all the cranks that were being turned, and then, like you said, what technology was doing in terms of just access to music, let alone, waging a war. I still think that those years in that era are so pivotal and unprecedented, and it'll never happen again, ever. But again, at least being there musically, the Vietnam experience was what it was. But I wouldn't have survived Vietnam without music, and I probably wouldn't have kept going this long if I didn't still have music in my life as a way for me to make those kind of connections and associations, and maybe just to hold on while all that gyrating that you just did a nice job of summarizing was happening. Boom, boom. Almost every day, it seemed like you were swiveling in some way.
Yeah. I wonder how much of that rebellion, when it surfaced, right? When you started to have people just openly defying the expectations of the previous generation. I wonder how much of that was because they'd had such a different experience. Now war is war, right? War is hell. I'm sure that World War II was, I'm a student of history. I I have a sense, at least intellectually, of how brutal that was, but it was way different. It was way different than Vietnam, and when all the generals are World War II vets, and the fight doesn't look anything like World War II,
Not close.
you know, um, I just wonder if that's. I'm trying to draw sort of a causal relationship here, kind of a cause and effect, right? I mean, are they rebelling because it's natural to rebel at that age, or are they rebelling because their reality does not seem to match in any way the perception of their leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably a little bit of both, but I think more the latter. I mean, it's just the sense that I had of, you know, this is this is not this is not the world that we want, and it's not how we want to do this. And you're wrong. Um, and but they, I mean, if you're in a situation like I mean, they hold all the cards. I mean, they can put your ass in jail. They can keep you in Vietnam. Um, they can make your life miserable. So, but I do think, if one place I saw that and realized, I'm a college grad, so I'm old for a GI in Vietnam, you know, because I graduated from college. I turned 22, so I'm 23 when I'm in Vietnam. I mean, that's like an old. Plus, I'm a college grad. I'm smarter than the people that are giving me orders. Luckily, I had enough commanding officers that knew that and just let us do our jobs, because we know what we're doing. We're college grads. We're all journalists. We know how to put a paper together. We know how to interview. We know how to write a story. We know how to write a headline. We know how to put a caption on a photo. So, you know, we can do that. But I'm sort of the exception in terms of that and what I've been through. But then don't push me any further. I mean, don't punish me. Don't put me in danger. Don't do something stupid. And we weren't gonna stand for that as well as we could stand up to it. But it's a little different. I mean, I think it was still there, but you know, I think for some of the younger guys, especially coming out of rural America, just out of high school, um, you know, it that hadn't yet happened. Um, but boy, you get your eyes open in Vietnam. Then how do you come back here and make sense of all the craziness and chaos? Plus, there's no parades. There's no welcome home. There's nothing. There's no healing.
Yeah, yeah, that seems to be, you know, that's kind of the through line for every episode that we do on this podcast, every person I interview, every topic that we try to cover. That comes up. The lack of a welcome home is. I don't think we've done an episode where that wasn't talked about. And it's tragic, and as you said earlier in the conversation, it's shameful. On the other hand, the way that you guys looked after each other, because your grateful nation wasn't looking after you, right? The way you changed the VA because it wasn't working for Vietnam vets. The way that you changed, I mean, of course, you changed warfare. The way that you changed, how troops are treated when they come home, how the reentry process, um, the way that you changed, uh, you guys changed combat medicine.
Mhm.
You changed everything for the generations that followed, and the fact that we have a wall, a Vietnam Veterans Memorial, is not a gift from a grateful nation. You guys did that for each other,
Right. Right.
right? And so, out of this sort of shameful neglect on the part of the American public, and I'm generalizing grossly here,
Sure.
but out of that came, you know, it's the argument I would make for your generation being the greatest generation.
Well, I love that. And we Vietnam vets should, um, pay more attention to the kind of things you just said. And I think, guys like me, lucky enough, to sort of, I'm always have it with me, but get beyond it, make it into something that for me that almost became like a career in a way. Um, and then helping others along the way. But I think I like the way you summarize that because, you know, too much emphasis is put on, the disgrace and the shame, et cetera, the shunning and the not welcoming. And that's almost become like a tagline for us and who we were and what we did. Whereas I think what you just, summarized is more fitting and I think is truer in many, many ways. And, but I just think there's just, when you bottle up trauma and pain for 30, 40, or 50 years, it you can't, you just can't nick away. It doesn't go away. And I think that's to me what bothered me the most. And it's what we saw at Vet's house. And that was people just needed somebody to listen. They needed somebody to understand. Now, of course, not all the guys at Vet's house had been in Vietnam. Most of them had. All were vets, and a lot of us had been in Vietnam. But again, as we've pointed out, my experience is way different from theirs. But just to listen, that's like the beauty of what's going on by Marvin Gaye. He's Frankie Gaye, his brothers in Vietnam, having a hell of a time. And writing letters home. That's the way we communicated. We couldn't email or text or Instagram. We wrote letters, and Marvin's reading Frankie's letters, and he meets Frankie when he comes back from Vietnam and says, "Hey, I'm here to listen," and that's what you're doing right now, and that's the beauty of that. It's like if I'm going to be able to appreciate and understand and assimilate any of this, I got to listen because I wasn't there. I got to know what being there was, and that was the beauty, I think, of what Marvin Gaye did. Because if you listen to what's going on, the original album version, as each song just sort of segues into the next, and then Inner City Blues goes back to what's going on.
So the album is a loop.
Exactly, and
Mhm.
it's Frankie Gaye and every Vietnam vet coming back saying, mercy, mercy me. You know what I mean? Like. Uh, is the planet going to blow up? I mean, am I going to get a job? Am I going to find God or am I going to do drugs? Um, am I going to throw a brick through a window? Or am I going to, replace the window? It's just, and I think that's what we've lost with it. We're better in terms of accepting, supporting, applauding, but how much better are we listening and understanding? What do we really know about the 8 million veterans of these recent wars and what they're going through? And I think we have to find ways to breach that gap and listen and appreciate. You're never gonna be them, but maybe listening. I think if we'd have listened to more Vietnam vets, we wouldn't have put so many names on another wall. And that's guys that just never got home and took their lives.
Right. Yeah. I'm really glad that you mentioned Marvin Gaye because it reminds me of all the all the other folks that we didn't talk about. There just isn't time, right? We didn't talk about Curtis Mayfield.
Oh, love
We didn't
Curtis.
talk about Archie Bell, right? Which
Yep.
is only maybe tangentially related, but um, we may have to talk again at some point. There's a
I
lot.
think we should because you've got a depth of understanding and appreciation, not just for the ear and the experience, but the music. And again, I know I'm sounding like I'm beating a dead horse, but you can't separate what went on and what happened and what we became, what we were, without the music. It's just so much a part of that.
Yeah. Well, I'm a jazz musician, and I listen to, as you can tell from our conversation, I listen to everything. I don't care what label somebody puts on it. Like if I hear it and it moves me, then it goes right into my collection. So I listen to everything from Merle Haggard and Dwight Yoakam to Freddie Hubbard and John Coltrane and um, one of the things I love about that music and particularly from the mid 50s through the mid 60s, you know, which I think of as the most significant contribution that our country has ever made to the world culturally, artistically, um, is that you can hear in it what's going on,
Mhm.
right? You can listen to Miles Davis's record On the Corner, and you can hear in that what's going on the corner, right? Um, but I've never looked at jazz through the lens. I mean, and so from a civil rights standpoint, from a Black Power standpoint, I've always heard that in the music. I hear that in Nina Simone. I hear that in Freddie Hubbard.
Mhm.
Um, um, you know, I hear it in Archie Shepp and Ornette Coleman. But I never listened to any of that music through the filter of the Vietnam War. And maybe it's impossible to decouple the Vietnam War from the civil rights movement, but I don't think so. I think I need to go back and listen again to some of my favorite music. And
Well, I got one good suggestion for you, but I mean, and very impressed with your jazz awareness and appreciation. There's a guy named Billy Bang, who is a wonderful, wonderful jazz violinist. Um, but a session guy, very good. He had one of those moments, came back from Vietnam, um, was an absolute mess. Um, got, as a couple other guys said, got blackenized in the service. Was ready to come home and fight the power and fight the war, fight the civil rights war, armed and dangerous. And the crew told him to go in to this pawn shop and get a gun. And he's waiting for the guy. He's got the money, you know, that it's his money. He says saved his money, sent his GI Bill and whatever benefits he was getting, his muster pay. Um, and his job was to go in this pawn shop and get the weapon. And he's in there, and he had done some musical training as a kid. And there's a violin on the wall, you know, and so he buys the violin and not the gun, and he becomes this virtuoso. And he did 3 albums. He never finished the third, which when he went back to Vietnam, but he's done a couple about Vietnam. And then what he did was the other musicians he recruited to be in his ensemble were Vietnam vets. So he's got a song, Tunnel Rat, Flashlight in a 45, that is searing. I mean, it'll make your eyes burn. But listen to Billy Bang, and that's what's happening on the corner with a Vietnam vet is what's happening with Billy Bang. Unfortunately, we had an interview set up with him, and I was over the moon excited because my dad was a big jazz guy. He sang in some big bands, and even though Billy Bang wouldn't have been to his liking, it's jazz. And but Agent Orange, he was a grunt. He had it tough in Vietnam. 63 years old, he died um, before we could talk to him. But Billy Bang, and then bringing it forward, I don't know if you're familiar with the pianist, the new jazz pianist VJ Iyer, um, and he did an album a few years ago with a bunch of Iraq and Afghan vets. It's jazz and interpretation and spoken word about the experience of soldiers put to music. Um, and in fact, he's coming here next month. I love the guy. He's a great jazz pianist. He's very, very new, very different, very experimental, but really good. So I think you're right. That again, music doing that, jazz in particular, as a way to get into the experience.
yeah, yeah, you know, I guess because jazz stopped being America's popular music, it's easy to overlook it. But has always been and remains America's classical music.
Yep.
And you and I have not talked about, I mean, we should have for everything that we talked about from the timeline of changes in attitudes to sort of pivotal figures at different times, and important songs of different on different themes. We should have we should have had a conversation about jazz in each of those contexts, right? Because
No, that's well, we're not dead yet, and you know, I the grist for more mill and more. We could, as we both know. I mean, you talked about the tangents we were going on in country music. You know, we've basically scratched the surface, but in a way that I think is going to be good for your listeners because, of your understanding of music and how we contextualize it, and we'll just have to pick up on other conversations other times because there's a lot of really good music to talk about.
have you guys created a playlist anywhere on YouTube or Spotify or Apple TV that to
You
as a
know,
companion to your book?
yeah, the UMass Press was going to handle that, and lovely people, but they didn't have a lot of resources and didn't have a good bandwidth. They started something on Apple iTunes and then never finished it. Um, I put when I wrote "Who'll Stop the Rain," which is my third book, which was basically a follow up to "We Got to Get Out of This Place." I put a playlist on Spotify of all the songs that are mentioned in "Who'll Stop the Rain." Um, but no, it doesn't. The great thing is, I was teaching a class to a bunch of senior citizens, and somebody was saying, why didn't you have a CD? This is old school. Why didn't you have a CD with the book? Well, we said, music rights, etc. And one woman, the oldest woman in the class, raised her hand. She says, when I'm reading it, she says, I say, Alexa, play "We Got to Get Out of This Place." So she had the music at every interval she wanted. So, but we haven't done that ourselves, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, we're trying to figure out how we're going to do it as a companion to this episode. Um, and it won't be easy.
I know,
Because
it's too bad.
I mean, it could be extremely long and dense. Or, we could optimize for something a little more digestible, but then, like you said, we would only be scratching the surface. Maybe that's okay for now. Maybe it's okay if we leave some room to come back and revisit this topic in a future episode and go a little deeper.
I'd like that very much.
Mm. Yeah, and we can talk about jazz maybe
Hmm.
in that deep dive. I can't believe that I've never connected those dots before. I've also been thinking about whether there's a way in this format to talk about the photography. When we think about you said it was the first television war. You talked about the fact that it was the first time war was in people's living rooms, and that is, for sure the more significant fact. But it doesn't it doesn't diminish the fact that photography also was an important part of
Huge.
how the war was covered. And you can think of, there's so many iconic photographs from Vietnam.
Yep.
But I wonder if there's a way to talk about photography in a podcast in a way that would be compelling or engaging at all, right? I mean, with music, I can play clips
Right.
um,
Yeah.
to
You
illustrate what we're
can't show
talking
it.
about, but how do you
Yeah.
do that with photography
Yeah.
in
No,
this format?
no, and you're absolutely right because those images, so many of them are so striking, and so reminiscent of that era. The Eddie Adams shot of, the guy shooting in the Tet Offensive. I mean, yeah, you can't get more visceral and harrowing than that. And Malcolm Brown with the self-immolating monk. You're right. There's a whole gallery of striking iconic images, um, from that war. Um,
Yeah, the girl
one,
running from the napalm.
yeah, the Napalm girl who I got to meet when she was here a couple of years ago when she was visiting and selling her book. Um, and one of the guy that took the photo was with her, Nick Hutt, who trained with some of the guys that era of great journalists who were there, the Peter Arnett's and the Morley Safers and the Horst Fosses. Um, but you're right, it would be. That's the problem is, we can sit and describe it to somebody. I mean, some of the listeners would know it in their heads, but it's still, not seeing it dilutes it quite a bit. Um, and that's part of what our office did. When when I got there, I could have been command information or public information. Command information, you did the newspaper, put it together. You did command newsletters. You did the magazine, and you know, anything else they wanted you to do around the base, the morning and evening news roundup. Public information, you grabbed a photographer and went out in the field and did stories on units or home down press releases, or you know, and I ended up getting the guy I replaced was command information, so that's where I was. I could have easily had the other, and by the time we were sending everybody home, when I was leaving, we did both. You know, and I had to be my own photographer. Um, but there were a lot of really good photographers in that office, um, that that did some really good work that you know you've probably seen and known. And I think there was just somebody when Larry Burroughs died, or they had there was a new book out. Life, I think, did it. Time Life um, published like 50 years of iconic images, and some of the photography in that war is absolutely stunning. And as you pointed out, really good photographers add photography. And we had some of that in our office because that's the way we told our story. You got to put it in the newspaper. You can't just write the story. You got to have a good picture to go with that story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amazing.
But we're
Well,
just getting started. I mean, let's
yeah,
face it. You know, we could keep on keeping on. And I just appreciate your indulging me. And I'm glad you're liking the book.
indulging you. I feel like you're indulging me.